Good evening. My name is Dr. Jennifer Lee. Welcome to our discussion. Ballroom has something to say about being human and the struggle for freedom in the face of catastrophe. Between two pandemics, a ballroom protocol of becoming, a hegemony and resistance discourse, and a Kairos moment of reckoning. I am so honored to be joined by my father, ballroom icon and Hall of Famer, Michael Robertson, tonight. Michael is a public health practitioner, advocate, activist, artist, curator, and leader within the LGBTQ plus community. He is the co-creator of the nation's only Black gay research group and National Black Gay Men's Advocacy Coalition, as well as an adjunct professor at the New School University, Lane College, New York City, and Union Theological Seminary, New York City. He is an international art and politics consultant and a member of the International Sound Art Collective entitled Ultra Red. Michael is also a scholar in residence for the Center for Race, Religion, and Economic Democracy, as well as a recent TED Media resident, where he performed a global TED Talk about the underground Black Latinx house ball and ballroom community entitled The Enduring Legacy of Ballroom. Michael also serves as a cultural consultant for the Pose FX television show. And additionally, he is a public health advisor and community engagement specialist for the New York City COVID-19 Contract Tracing Initiative. With all that said, hi, Father Michael. It's so nice to have you. Did I forget anything else about your bio, or would you like to add anything before we jump into some of the questions tonight?
No, I think, first of all, you read it so wonderfully. It was so smooth, like the flow of Niagara Falls. So,
Thank you. So tonight, I'm going to ask you a few questions. We have a lot of objectives to meet tonight, but I just wanted to make sure that given that we have such a short time, I thought it would be best if I was able to ask you some questions and you could just share your wisdom, expertise, and knowledge with everyone tonight. So my first question for you is, marginalized by prejudice, violence, housing insecurity, and HIV infection rates, among other burdens, Black and brown transgender and gender nonconforming people experience particular challenges in establishing secure, nourishing communities, both within the LGBTQ plus spaces and in society at large. Please tell me about the House and Ballroom community, a formidable social movement and creative collective for the LGBTQ persons of color in responding to such stigmas to form self-sustaining social networks.
that was a very loaded question, but a good one. And so let me back into sort of my relationship to how I was introduced to, and then then do this a brief historical narrative. I originally from Camden, New Jersey, right? So Camden is a small inner city across the bridge from Philadelphia. And so I was born there, reared there, went to school there, went to college there, went to Rutgers University, applied to law school twice, and got accepted twice and put on a waiting list, and I got tired of waiting. And I began working for the Camden City Board of Education. So very interesting, as we're sitting here talking, this relationship between me entering, not getting into law school, be put on a waiting list, making a decision to, or getting a job working for the Board of Education, and how in many ways that entered me into ballroom. So very interesting that what I'm going to say about that. And so I began working for the Kansas City Board of Education. And then I began working at two hospitals doing psychiatric emergency at the same time. And at the same time, I began facilitating a support discussion group for LGBT young folk of color at a Black gay indigenous organization called Colors. And so it was there in many ways that things began to ferment for me. There were some young folk who went to Camden High School where I worked, who began to be part of my life. And as I was going out into community, being voyeuristic, if you will, around the house ballroom community, seeing folks in a club performing voguing, being in awe of it, not necessarily understanding that it was a cultural production of a historical community, not at all. Didn't even have the language to understand that. But also just seeing maybe 3-4 years prior Paris is burning, so making these connections. But I entered into the houseball community through a couple of my kids. So following that, even though I was out, even though I was around it longer, they gave me sort of the courage, if you will, to be a member. And so I began being part of the community in 1994, 95. Uh, began was a member of the House of Romeo Gilly, which is a small Philadelphia house. And then I left that house and became a member of the House of Ebony. House of Ebony was created in 1978 in Brooklyn, but I became a member of Philadelphia, excuse me. And then I left Ebony in 1999, early 2000, and me and my son, Damon Hughes, my good friend Preston, created a House of Blonick. And we intentionally created a house that we wanted to be a sort of intersection of both African Americans and Latinos. Because one of the things we noticed was there was a sort of dichotomy racially between the two in houseball community. And then I left that and created some other things. But I bring that up in that way to talk about this space of not when one door closes, that another door opens, and you oftentimes don't know why that door is open. So it was the unfolding of the universe, if you will, inviting me in to be part of this historical narrative, right? And so oftentimes when people hear ballroom, they think ballroom dancing, right? And so particularly people who are not part of the community. And so one of the things I oftentimes do is this sort of this real brief historical narrative that allows people to not only understand it, but make sort of these sort of connections, these dots to the history of it and why we are where we are today. But the houseball ballroom community really emerges out of the 1920s Harlem Renaissance. I oftentimes say that if not for slavery, if not for the Emancipation Proclamation, if not for after the Emancipation Proclamation and the creation of Black Reconstruction and its dismantle, and the rise of lynching as a form of social control, and the creation of the KKK, if not for Black folk in the southern part of the United States moving to New York, to the north, looking for a new home, we call it the Great Migration. If not during that time between 1919 and 1931, the creation of this sort of radical Black artistic political movement called the Harlem Renaissance. And in this space, and Harlem becomes our new home, in this space, folks became homeless in this new home. The Black church created a 3-decade campaign to get rid of Black queers in Harlem. And there were 3 ways that Black queers congregated in Harlem, which was in beauty salons, in having rent parties, and this thing called drag balls. The drag balls become what I call a sort of both political but also a theological movement to be able to create a home for folk who were deemed homeless in the new space of freedom. And so when you think about sort of the migration of Black folk, and particularly around freedom movements, ballroom to me comes out of that same Black freedom movement. In fact, after World War II, where other cities become Blacker, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, DC, these drag balls migrate to these spaces. But in 1967, there is a Black trans woman named Crystal LaBeija who resisted racism in the drag ball circuit, and she is at a drag ball. She protests because she talks about the notion that someone else wins who was white, and she thought it was everything to do with not only colorism but also race. And there was a guy named Phil Black, who at the time was the only African American performer who had a Screen Actors Guild card. And he says to Crystal, let's go back to an old circuit that we created in Harlem, and it's Black, and create our own movement again, if you will. And between 1967 and 1973, you began to see the morphing of a community that's not grounded just in performativity and just trans folks performing, but the creation of a house that becomes a politics. I oftentimes, let me push back on that. I oftentimes or think back on it. I oftentimes think about the way that we look at space, right, as geography. And we think of Harlem in this not only romantic retrospective way, but as a space that is so huge. And Harlem really is a community that exists, of course, in Manhattan. And so you think about that north to south, Harlem's probably no more than 30 to 35 blocks north to south, and maybe 15, 16 blocks east to west. And so here you have in this space, so this political movement of folk organizing, right? That are borrowing from sort of the Black struggle for freedom during the 1960s as well. And so these trans women create a movement in many ways out of that. And so you begin to see the construction of houses. 1968, the very first house was created, the House of La Beja. There were other houses that began to be created between 68 and 73. And 73 is important because that's the first time that a gay man participated in the house ball community. And so the construction of a house was now mother, father, and children. Children who had been ostracized out of community, ostracized out of their own family, and needing home. And so the house has become sort of their home. But they're also, but this time is also in relationship to a lot of the artistic movements at the time. Hip hop was created, the very first hip hop party was created in 1973. And so the New York poet movement was created around the same time. I think about salsa as a sort of Afro, Puerto Rican, New Yorican, particularly jazz-infused artistic movement, looking at the disenfranchisement of a people both in Harlem and the Bronx. And so this is in relationship to those things. And so it was so important to be able to create such a project, if you will, these things called houses, because ballroom is prophetic. Had no idea, but here's a prophecy of ballroom that 19 years later that would be confronted with sort of the AIDS crisis.
So my next question is, most current research really pathologizes the ballroom community in ways describing how the community just has a higher HIV prevalence and is disproportionately impacted by HIV and AIDS or the epidemic. And little is really known or documented regarding the sociocultural challenges that ballroom members experience and how they resist hegemony through their own embodied knowledge, community organizing, and practices inherent to the house and ballroom community. So I was just hoping you could describe a bit more about how the house and ballroom community is a space of organizing toward freedom, our own wellness, and moreover, in this moment, how does ballroom organize?
So I had to sit with that for a little bit. So excuse my pause. So I'm thinking about sort of reflecting on, excuse me, what this particular moment happens to be saying in 2021, right? So if one thinks about the 2020 ushered in our lifetime, so the most devastating pandemic that has a global impact, COVID. In the midst of COVID, illuminated even more so, was the sort of racial reckoning that we had to deal with. Right? So the police violence, state violence over Black bodies, particularly as George Floyd's murder magnified, began to create this movement, if you will, right? Re-energize a movement. And it's important to say re-energize as opposed to create, because create then suggests, again, that though Black women created Black Lives Matters, that we pay attention to it most when Black men get beat and brutalized. So I don't want to make that mistake. So it re-energized. Black Lives Matters, right? And so as we moved into this year, in January 6th happened the attack on the Capitol. So this sort of unraveling, if you will, our fragile democracy. The 2021 is also the 40th anniversary of AIDS. And AIDS in particular highlighted sort of the struggles. We didn't know that then. Those of us who are part of the community knew that. But the struggles around homophobia and its damage. You think about 1981 as Reagan becomes president, he ushers in sort of um, this new sort of political landscape of the Republican Party that was now no longer talking about small banks, um, less government, was more talking about global capitalization, or neoliberalism, private, privatizing, the cutting of social programs, um, and he was very um, silent around AIDS, right? Very silent around AIDS. In fact, when we think about Trump and the critique of Trump and his almost year ill response to it, Reagan allowed for 7 years that there'd be no response. So for 7 years, there was no response. And in the midst of that, 1984 ushered in the crack epidemic. And Black folk, because Reagan was cutting social programs, and we began to see the mass incarceration of particularly of Black and brown bodies, the disproportionate synthesis between crack and coke impacting again Black and brown men bodies, male bodies, begin to organize around that. And we made a political and intentional decision to deal with crack and said not AIDS. Because if Black gay men were getting AIDS, Black gay men deserved it. It was God's way of getting rid of perversion from the earth. And it was Black gay men's punishment. And so Black gay men had to begin to organize in such a way, right? I think about gay men's health crisis was created in 1982, the very first community-based organization to be created in response to AIDS. And Black gay men began to feel that white gay men were not addressing sort of the needs, the particular needs of Black gay men. So they began organizing, creating things like Gay Men of African Descent in 1986, right? Creating things like Adodi, which was a spiritual sort of organizing group. Other countries, which was a political literacy group of Black LGBT folk. NMAC, National Minority AIDS Council. But here is sort of the resistant discourse and hegemony, right? Hegemony just means power. That even in discourses, even in movements that resist against power over, winds up doing the same thing to those who are even more marginalized. So as communities, Black gay men begin organizing over against homophobia in Black community and what was perceived as white gay racism in relation to AIDS, use this notion of classism over the houseball community and begin to organize and ostracize the houseball community out of its organizing. And so houseball had to organize for itself, literally, because it couldn't go to these newly formed Black gay organizations because of classism. It wasn't white, so white gay organizing, and because of homophobia, it could not. So it had to really create itself, let alone it was at that moment, at that time, a predominantly, overwhelmingly working and poor young community. So folks began to die. And the community had to take care of itself, had to organize itself, began to migrate out of New York City in 1986 to Washington, D.C., to other cities like Philadelphia, 1989, and Baltimore, 1990, organizing with crack and AIDS, convening at one time in this community, but had no agency, right? Agency in the sense of a building, of a structure to advocate for itself, but had to find its own agency, its own body, its own community to advocate for its own self. And I think there's no other time during, at least in my lifetime, had I seen the houseball community having to do this, but under the guise of larger communities, um, just dying, absolutely dying, absolutely having to collect any money that it could to bury people, right? To house people. And so this being the 40th anniversary is sort of a reminder of Dr. James Cone talks about God is with the oppressed. Paulo Freire talks about the pedagogy of the oppressed, that when those who are so marginalized are at the brink of annihilation, it, it becomes absolutely creative around its own survival. And in its creativity around its own survival, it creates pedagogical formulations around what it means to be human. To understand the notion of this title, what it really means to be human in this struggle for freedom, right? In the face of real catastrophe, death all day, every day, and nobody seemingly to care. Now, who do you go to? And so it's a reminder, I think, this year of all of those things. So these intersections of a 40th anniversary of AIDS in conversation with the global pandemic of COVID, in the midst of a racial reckoning around police violence, there's no other community to be able to talk about. Not only to be able to talk about, to be able to teach the world over about this. Last thing I say about this, to some degree, it's very interesting, though, right? That as a tragedy occurred to George Floyd, around the same space, if you will, not too far in Minnesota, a trans woman, Black, named Ayana, I can't think of her last name. I want to say Dior, but I could be wrong. Was being beat, right? Being beat in front of a store, drug out of a store. Think about 20 guys beating her. And somehow she had the hysterical, whether she knew it or not. So somehow the ancestors were in her, had the historical wherewithal to say, I'm going to drag my body back into the store. And if you're going to beat me and kill me, you're going to do it on a camera so it can be seen. So that the world over will know what happened, but not just to me, but to those who look like me all day, every day. You know, and that wherewithal is the relationships to Black freedom movement. You think about Emmett Till's mother, who in 1954 had to do the same exact thing to her son, who was beat by a gang of white men because of so-called whistling at a white woman, and so beat and brutalized that was so unidentifiable. And the mother made the political intentional decision, had Black publications, Jet, Essence, I think Essence is around, so Jet, Ebony, to come take pictures, to archive, right? The funeral, and had an open casket and did nothing to the body, wouldn't do a change on the body, because she wanted the world over to know what happens to Black people all day, every day. Those things are, to me, are not accidental. These sort of moments, these freedom moments in the freedom movement, if you will. Because house ball is predominantly in the U.S. context, Black and Latino. So I'm going to date myself and use the Latino versus Latinx and not say brown particularly. And I'll go back to why. Excuse me. LGBT, which then says that every disparity that impacts Black folk are going to impact this community because it's Black, right? That every disparity impacts Latinos are going to impact this community because it's Latino. And that every disparity impact L folks, B folks, G folks, T folks impact this community because of all of those things. So here are all these disparities. Again, the use of language intentionally converging and convening at the same exact time, right? All day, every day, right? Somehow the community continues to grow, continues to culturally produce, continues to theologize about what it means to matter, continues to politically organize around that we have the right to live. So.
Thank you for that. You talked about in this moment, we are at the intersection of anti-Blackness, where we have witnessed Black bodies brutalized and murdered. We're living in a police state, along with the global pandemic, putting a mirror on a healthcare system that creates health inequities and disproportionately impacts even more marginalized people worse than just the general public. And we're also in the 40th year of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So I just want to ask you a little bit more to expand upon in this moment for Ballroom Teaching the World about being human, the struggle for freedom in the face of catastrophe.
So can you pause that?
Thank you for that. My next question is, Black prophetic tradition not only sees a way forward, but offers the necessary critique of the present moment. And this is the gift of ballroom at its core. Ballroom has been courageous in daring to ask the question, in this moment of Black Lives Matter, which Black lives matter most?
It's part of the challenge with having in this moment to deal with high numbers of HIV. So in some ways, we've centralized HIV so much within this community that it is not necessarily the priority, right? In fact, if you believe that it is your predisposition to become HIV positive, then that is absolutely not your priority to be HIV negative or live, right? So so it's the same thing with sort of defunding the police. If for instance, this is the messiness of this dialogue at this moment we have to have, right? And so it's very challenging, I think, for instance, a Black trans to then engage in that dialogue with Black cis men and say, the police violence over me, we need to change sort of police are not only policing, but the brutality over Black men's bodies, that has to shift. Black men's women would then respond, well, you're probably right, but who we get beat by is you, right? Who we're not getting beat by necessarily is the police. Who I'm dying from is from the hands of Black cisgender men who then say they're heterosexual. And so we gotta have that murky conversation. I'm back into this notion that you asked around who lives matters most. We do it in a multiple way in some ways. If you think historically around sort of the AIDS crisis, it's a wonderful documentary called How to Survive a Plague. And at the end of the documentary, sort of the ACT UP AIDS organizers were sitting around having a discussion around, they thought that their lot in life was to watch each other die. Everyone was passing away, so they thought that's exactly what's going to happen. And although we're organizing politically, it appears that people are still dying on our eyes. And so we have to reconcile with the fact that that is just going to be our destiny. And then they say in the documentary, and then we begin to live. And I remember watching it and said, who are the we that they were talking about? So what they meant was, because in 1996 was the creation from Merck Pharmaceuticals of the triple pill therapy that allowed folk who were HIV positive to go undetectable, right? And so you began to see sort of the prevalence and the incidence numbers, particularly with white gay men, go down. But who are the we that they were talking about? Why do I say that? This is 1996. 2001, they did an HIV prevalence study called YMSM. Of course, MSM just means men with sex administered. Y is the young folk. And what came out of that study was the HIV prevalence studies, and this is CUNY grad school in terms, so I don't necessarily need to tell you what prevalence means, but prevalence just means how many people have it. And so what came out of that study was that 33%, one of the things that came out of that study was that 33% of African-American men who were sex and men between the ages of 23 and 29 was HIV positive. Now that was a big deal for folk. absolutely, the number. Because at that time, there was really probably no epi done on this community. So a lot of the things that we were going with was anecdotal. We knew, we are part of community. So we knew, and it was hard for us to justify that the numbers were in our communities, the disease burden was in our community, but the dollars were not there. This gave us sort of the justification. So that was 2001. Who were we were talking about? 2002 happened, and they did an incidence study. And incidence just means how fast an infection is growing. One of the things we know that in order we think about COVID, then we think about New York State, that Cuomo wanted the incidence of COVID, the positivity rate to be below 3%, right? And so one of the things that happened out of that YMSM2 study was that white men who had sex with men in that same age range, between 23 and 29, the incident rate was about 1.5 to 2%. It's absolutely fabulous. So here is the we that they were talking about. Think about 96, Merck Pharmaceuticals, the triple pill therapy, undetectable, 1.5 to 2% about 6 years later. Absolutely wonderful. Not only because of the triple pill therapy, but there's some structural issues that we were not dealing with in terms of public health in relationship to HIV prevalence and incidence, race, class, and all those other things. For Latino men, or sex with men in that same age range between 23 and 29, the incident rate was about 3.5 to 5%, which is faster than it needs to be. If we're looking at an elimination or leveling off an infection. In sub-Saharan Africa at that time, excuse me, when there was about 24 million people who were HIV positive, the incident rate was 6%, 3 times as fast as white MSMs. With African American men who were sex with men, the incident rate was 13%, right? Twice as fast as sub-Saharan Africa. Who are the we that they were talking about? Right? 2003, they did a study on the houseball community, a prevalence study. And in New York City, what came out of that study was that 70% of houseball members in New York City was HIV positive. It's huge, particularly thinking of the marginalized community and within a marginalized community in a general location, so New York City. In 2005, they did another prevalence study, HIV prevalence study. It was called the CDC. It's a 5-city study and looked at New York City, Baltimore, Miami, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And out of that study, no longer was the prevalence rate 33%, but now it was 46% of Black gay men were HIV positive. Who are the we that we're talking about? I can go on and on about other sort of epidemiological data, but the numbers have continued to increase, right? And so when you talk about whose lives matters most, when we're talking about sort of within a larger LGBT movement around AIDS, as white gay men numbers began to go down, you had very little dialogue around it outside of our community, with those who were doing the work within our community. Right? And so now we're in a space where a lot of their voices around marriage equality and young Black gay men numbers continue to increase. In fact, in 2011, CDC put out for the very first time in the history of the epidemic that new HIV infection rates were on a decline, except for with Black gay men. There was a 48% increase. Who lives matters most? And so when you think about Black Lives Matters and sort of this political space in relationship to police violence, right? And as it was created, particularly in relationship to Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, by these 3 Black women, 2 of them Black queer women, at the same moment were the increases in numbers of Black trans women beaten, brutalized, and murdered. But there was absolutely no outcry. So the question again, who lives matters most? And so I think that, again, this notion of a hegemony in resistant discourse, that if we don't get to a place that we are pushing beyond those hegemonic notions of power, of being, of mattering, if we don't have those kind of messy conversations, we're going to reinscribe the very oppression that we're fighting against. And so that, to me, this moment we have them at this moment in time, we have an opportunity to atone for, to be able to get it right. And I think, to your question, that in many ways the houseball community is the apt community to be able to effectively address. Right, it does have something to teach, has something to learn as well. Right, it has to be in dialogue with other global and historical struggles, but it absolutely has something to teach. Mostly, and not only, but mostly because it has been so marginal, right? It's had to create. It has been so autonomous in its marginality in many ways. It's had to. It borrows from other historical struggles, whether it's ACT UP, right? Whether it's sort of the Black gay movement around the AIDS crisis, whether you're thinking about civil rights or SNCC. I mean, it can borrow from so many other movements. And because it's so marginal, it really does have something to teach the world over. And because it's been doing the work, having to do the work. What's very interesting is that if, for instance, you go to a lot of these sort of community-based organizations that have been funded to do HIV prevention work, that a lot of the folk who are doing on the front line of doing the work are houseball members. And so this is one of the other reasons that I think houseballs is more apt to be able to do this work.
Thank you so much for this meaningful discussion. Do you have any last thoughts or comments or anything else to add? And I do want to say defunding police, meaning reallocating resources to other community initiatives and things like that. So I'm sorry if I misspoke on that.
I think you did well. And the reason I said that, because I think if you ask the ballroom, that language would have been used first and foremost. The notion of defunding, understandably, if you had said, we're talking about community-based or the nonprofit industrial complex and its violence over houseball members would have said defund them. You understand it? Partly it's because of where they think the biggest threat is coming from. And so the notion of defunding has everything to do with, you got stuck. You got stuck.
I'm still stuck?
No, you're not stuck now.
Okay.
But the notion of defunding the language has everything to do with the threat. So it makes sense for that to come out of in relationship to police violence over particularly Black cis men bodies. So it makes absolutely sense. That the ballroom will probably say we need to reallocate, right? But if you're talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, the threat around the lives of houseball, in fact, the capital gain that these nonprofits seem to benefit from, then ballroom probably would use that language. So that's the only reason I said that they probably would not use the language around defund the police, but reallocate.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to clarify that point. But beyond that, you just brought up another really important part around capitalism and how ballroom bodies have become and generate numbers for nonprofits and CBOs doing this work. And I just think that was a really important part for folks to take with them as we move into taking questions now. So, but do you have anything else you want to add before we go into the questions from the audience?
No, I appreciate this dialogue. I didn't realize it was done. Once I get going, I get going. And I appreciate this dialogue. I think it's an absolutely important dialogue to have, I think. I really do. I'm not saying it just to say it, but I really do think that it's an important dialogue. I think Paulo Freire talks about sort of the importance of dialogical spaces, right? That has to be able to resist against the academy's notion of theory, right? Not the reverse of that is just to have talk, right? Just let's just talk, but to be in dialogue, to place community's experience and understand its experience can theorize. In fact, it is the theory, it has the power to theory. I think that what you just did describe that, and I think that is absolutely sort of the work that House Ball is doing, whether it's House Lives Matters that you created and I helped you conceptualize, or the Ballroom Freedom School work. Period. It does privilege sort of the lives of the House Ball community or folks within the community and their experiences over necessarily theoretical frameworks, but it places them in dialogue.
Absolutely. And it's our own grounded theory that we create and develop as we go through real time in real freedom movement and liberation movement, through all of the reckoning that is happening. So thank you so much. And we'll move into questions from the audience now.